everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and what we're going to be talking about today is a new ruling that came down from federal court that has determined that the male-only draft is unconstitutional in the United States of America. This is a major victory for gender activists and men and women worldwide. And before we talk about the court ruling and the rationale, we are going to take a quick look at international leaders in terms of human rights for females. We're going to look at a leader from Nigeria, Japan, Great Britain, France, and we're going to look at the role that Marvel Comics has played recently in this push for equal rights for women. We are going to also look at the history of presidential opinion related to women registering for a selective service. We are also going to look at the role that this particular ruling plays in terms of the conflict with a prior Supreme Court ruling and what the role might be for legislators in terms of determining the role that women will play in the future in the military and the extent to which they will be required to register for the draft and selective service just as adolescent males. And then we're going to wrap it up with a look at perhaps the answer to that question, who runs the world, who run the world, quote unquote. And as a quick reminder, if this video appears on anything other than Dr. Tracy McCarthy, it is unauthorized and stolen. Let's get started. And as you can see, the international leadership for the fight for equal rights for men and women and those who are considered gender non-binary, this has been an international quest, and we're going to look at some of those leaders who have come on the world scene, not only in present times but in the past. It has been said that art imitates life, and in this situation you have art imitating life and life imitating art. And you can see, based upon the Black Panther film, that there was already this push in the arts sphere for women to be seen as capable of playing an active role in combat. And the first world leader for women's rights in terms of equal rights is a woman from Nigeria, and we're going to look at her work. And out of Nigeria we have Chimamanda Adichie, and she is perhaps best known for a piece that she has written, and it is Americana. And we should all be feminists is her position, and she has written a feminist manifesto with 15 suggestions for such. And so she is an up-and-coming feminist leader in the world and coming out of Nigeria. She might be considered the mother of feminism, coming from the motherland of Africa. And also a well-known leader coming out of Japan is Yoko Ono. And she has long been known for her position on women's rights and her advocacy of such. And another thing that Yoko Ono is known for is her 1972 essay known as The Feminization of Society, and this helped to mark the female revolution of the 1970s. And again, a more recent world leadership person in terms of women's rights, female rights, comes out of Britain. And Emma Watson coming out of the UK, as she is known for her He for She movement. She is one of the generation of equal rights for women. She's one of the newest voices in terms of feminism, and she gave what was known as a very moving speech in front of the United Nations that launched a new initiative for gender equality. One thing that Emma Watson was pushing for was for men to join into this fight, and so this really ties into this court case where men took up the fight to make sure that women and men were treated equally in terms of selective service. And some might consider France to be the world leader in women's rights and the feminist movement. And as many may recall, Simone de Beauvoir was an outspoken political activist, writer, and social theorist out of the 1940s. She wrote the famous piece known as The Second Sex. Her work at the time was considered well ahead of its time, and her book and her theories were credited for paving the way for what is known as modern feminism. So undoubtedly, she would be very pleased with this decision, and based upon her critiques of patriarchy and the social constructs that she believed shackled women. And then we have good old Rosie the Riveter, and she was a fictional character, but she was a character that was created to basically champion throughout the feminist movement the sense of female strength. And this was an empowering symbol for females as they were working during World War II. And then we have American writer and activist of the feminine mystique out of 1963. We have Betty Friedan. And Friedan spent her life working to achieve women's equality. And so she would be very pleased to have this decision and the implications of this decision for the future role of women in the military. And a trailblazing voice for transgender voices has been Janet Mock. And Janet Mock has been a journalist and a career advocate for trans rights. And so undoubtedly, Janet Mock would be very pleased with this determination of the court that the male-only draft is unconstitutional. And no highlight of the women's movement would be complete without some focus on who is known as the mother of feminism, and that is Gloria Steinem. And she led the women's liberation movements throughout the 1960s and 70s, and she was the co-founder of the feminist-themed Ms. magazine. So undoubtedly, she would be well pleased with the court's new determination that the male-only military draft is unconstitutional. And let's quickly look at a news piece here regarding presidential support for female combat duty. It was reported a couple of years ago that President Obama supported requiring women to register for selective service when they turn 18. He was at that time the first president to endorse the universal draft registration since Jimmy Carter. And one important thing that happened during the Obama administration is that women were advanced to combat positions in the military. And so that barrier was no longer there. And so what was stated was basically that old barriers for military service were being removed. The administration supported women registering for selective service, and this came out of the National Security Council. And here we have some reporting on the case. In Houston on Friday, a federal judge ruled that a law requiring only men to register for the military draft is unconstitutional. And this judge, Gray Miller, denied the government's motion to delay a lawsuit brought by a nonprofit group for men's rights. And so it's very interesting that this balancing of rights came from a men's rights group versus many of the women's rights groups that have been throughout history. And just to note, this lawsuit came in November of 2016, and it was originally brought by the National Coalition for Men. And what was reported was basically that women are now eligible for and have been integrated into the combat units. And so even though Congress did not make this determination that women needed to or would be required to register for the draft, this judge has determined that not having a balanced, neutral policy for the registration for the draft is unconstitutional. Now, what the government did do was ask Miller to delay the case pending a report that would determine whether women should be required to register for the draft, and that report isn't expected until 2020. However, this is a decision that has been made by this particular court. And the Coalition for Men, the National Coalition for Men, they did a press release and stated that they were pleased with the court's decision. And one of the arguments that was made is that even without the draft, when the men do not register for selective service, they can face prison time, they can face fines, they are also denied federal loans in terms of going to school, so that federal financial aid. And they also have to register in terms of their whereabouts with the government. So if they move, they have to register that. And women have not been held to this exact same standard. And so that's pretty much their argument. It's based upon the Fifth Amendment. It's definitely a direct challenge to the Supreme Court's ruling out of 1981. And many are saying that this looks like a very straightforward win for feminism, and this is also a win for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, some also are arguing that this case is complicated and that it brings up a question of whether women should be simply offered access to traditional male roles in the military, like combat positions, or whether they should be forced to assume those combat roles. Of course, a big issue is that women have now been admitted into the combat positions in the military, and so that argument that they are not equally suited to combat, it's a big issue now, since that has already been allowed and supported. Now, one thing notable in this case is that the government argued that there's a difference between allowing women to serve and requiring them to serve. However, the judge found the government's explanation both inadequate and unconvincing. In one report, it was reported that from the 1970s legal feminism standpoint, that this is a huge win, as it used a strategy that was often followed by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And this was to convince the Supreme Court to strike down laws based on sex stereotypes. And so to look at this another way, if adolescent boys do not register with selective service, they will not be eligible for federal financial aid. So what this ruling does is basically it supports equal protection for adolescent girls. And so the protection for adolescent boys and the protection for adolescent girls will be the same according to this court ruling. Of course, we'll have to see what happens after this. This is a major ruling. We'll have to see what the Supreme Court might say if it ever makes it to the Supreme Court, what the legislators might have to say, and what the current president has to say. And given that it is so close to the 2020 election cycle, this may become a very big issue for the election in terms of issues. One thing to remember is that the draft ended in 1973. However, all men in the United States from the ages of 18 to 25 still have to register with selective service. And as shown in these depictions, there has been a push in popular culture, in the arts, in the creative arts, in the music world, pushing the equal rights for women and men and not having rights based simply on gender roles or on sex stereotypes. And some of that push in popular culture has related to sort of this military type of theme. And the question has been, who run the world? And as you can imagine, the high number of women legislators right now, their response to the male-only military draft being deemed unconstitutional in this federal court, the response is probably going to be a very positive and resounding one. We haven't heard much about this ruling, however, but you can see that the women at the State of the Union were very excited about the idea and the reality that women are in Congress. They are in legislative positions in record numbers. And so surely they will see this as a major win for women. And there are a lot of new and seasoned individuals who perhaps may have a voice in this upcoming and growing issue related to women's rights and men's rights and this new ruling. And as stated in the news report, this raises a related problem of whether this important policy decision is something that should be left to Congress or whether it can be made by judicial fiat. Of course, based upon the policy determinations, past policy determinations of many of the members of Congress now, there will definitely be a significant push in the direction of making sure that men and women are treated equally in terms of the draft. And you can see how elated the women are on Capitol Hill for equal rights and for an equal voice in the government. And you can certainly look forward to more conversation coming from Capitol Hill undoubtedly regarding this particular ruling. And so as you are looking to think about what candidates need to be thinking about in upcoming elections, some of the things you might be thinking about are their positions regarding the male-only military draft being deemed unconstitutional. One thing that this ruling does is it brings to the forefront the conversation about gender roles, about masculinity and femininity, and how we are going to go forward as a country in terms of our values. What is important to us in terms of our values? Equal rights are very important for many reasons, and what we must remember is that with much right comes much responsibility. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.